Hey, it's the Cartoonkid back again with another fantastic fanfic idea. And today I'm bringing you Dead Rising, a Wild West story. Now you're probably wondering, why did I come up with this? Well, I remember reading this Time Lord Paradox story, Temporary Insanity. It's pretty much a crossover between one other zombie video game. What was it called? Hmm? Oh yeah, Resident Evil and the Mask. And it was actually kind of good. Hmm. So I thought to myself, hey, why not make my own crossover between a zombie franchise and Mask. So why not Dead Rising? Yeah, we might kind of like it. And again, for those who may not know, I don't play video games, but I do watch the like movies, specifically the cutscenes. But I digress. Story. Photojournalist Frank Gress received an anonymous tip from Willamette in Colorado, just as he always had, through cryptic channels and shadowy sources. What he didn't expect was the frantic phone call from his cousin, William West, a mild-mannered insurance adjuster who'd just been living quietly in Willamette for the past 5 years. William had always been the family oddball, collecting strange artifacts and studying ancient mythology. Frank remembered him as bookish and nervous, hardly the type to handle a crisis. But something had changed in William's voice during that brief call before the line went dead. A confidence that Frank had never heard before. Flying into town via helicopter, Frank observed the military quarantine and the violent incidents throughout the streets below. The pilot dropped him at the mall helipad as planned, but Frank noticed something peculiar. Scattered throughout the zombie hordes were bodies that looked different. Some appeared to have been torn apart with impossible strength, while others bore a wound that seemed almost surgical in their precision. Upon entering the mall, Frank discovered the full scope of the zombie outbreak. The undead had overwhelmed Willamette's population, turning the shopping center into a nightmare of shambling corpses and terrified survivors. But as Frank made his way through the corridors, he began to notice signs of another presence, one that was systematically clearing paths through the zombie masses. In the security room, Frank found Otis Washington, the janitor, who mentioned strange reports over the radio. Survivors were speaking of a figure with an enormous skull-like face with wild yellow eyes who appeared whenever the zombie masses became too overwhelming, cutting through them with inhuman speed and strength before vanishing again. Some described the figure as wearing a dark suit, but all focus on that massive, terrifying smile. Frank's first direct encounter with DHS agent Brad Garrison occurred during a firefight with an unknown assailant. But just as they were about to be overwhelmed, a figure in a dark suit materialized from the shadows. The being's most striking feature was its enormous head, a grotesque skull-like visage with a massive predatory grin filled with sharp teeth and mild manic yellow eyes that seemed to glow with malevolent intelligence. The figure moved with fluid grace, dispatching zombies with techniques that seemed to blend martial arts with something far more primal and violent. When the immediate threat was cleared, the creature simply tipped an invisible hat to Frank and melted back into the darkness. Throughout Frank's mission to rescue survivors, the skull-faced guardian continued to appear at crucial moments. When Frank was trapped in a bookstore trying to convince Russell to leave, zombies began breaking through the barricades. The masked figure materialized, its enormous grinning skull reflecting the fluorescent lights as it held the undead at bay with impossible strength, while Frank completed his rescue mission. The creature's yellow eyes seemed to take sadistic pleasure in the violence. While after Brad was infected and Frank ventured into the supermarket for medicine, he found the manager already unconscious and the captive woman freed. She spoke of having been saved by a someone with the face of death itself, a a skull with burning yellow eyes and teeth like a shark. She seemed uncertain whether her savior had been human at all, describing how the figure had laughed manically while brutally dispatching her captors. The pattern continued as Frank worked to uncover the truth about Santa Kaziba. Whenever zombie hordes threatened to overwhelm him, whenever psychotic survivors cornered him, the skull-faced figure would appear. Sometimes Frank caught glimpses of familiar mannerisms, the way the figure tilted his massive head when thinking, or when it nervously adjusted its cufflinks, even while wearing the horrific visage. The constant the contrast between the mundane gesture and the monstrous appearance was deeply unsettling. When Isabella Herkes revealed the truth about the wasp parasites in the Santa Kaziba research facility, Frank finally understood the full scope of the crisis. But he also began to piece together another mystery. The masked figure's appearances weren't random, they were strategic, always arriving precisely when Frank needed them most, as if someone was watching over him specifically. During the confrontation with Carlito in the parking garage, Frank found himself separated from Brad and surrounded by both zombies and explosives. The skull-faced figure appeared again, but this time Frank caught a glimpse of something familiar beneath the supernatural presence. A nervous laugh that he'd heard countless times during family gatherings. So now it echoed from that enormous grinning maw with disturbing intensity. As Frank fought to disarm the bombs, the skull-faced figure worked alongside him with uncanny coordination. They moved as if they'd been partners for years, anticipating each other's actions. When Carlito, who was mortally wounded, and Brad was consumed by the zombie horde, the figure helped Frank carry his fallen partner to safety, dis- displaying genuine grief even as its massive skull face maintained that permanent horrifying grin. The butcher who held Carlito captive proved to be one of the figure's most challenging opponents. Frank watched in amazement as the skull-faced guardian seemed to tap into a primal fury, moving with animal-like ferocity while maintaining strategic thinking. The combination of raw power and tactical awareness was unlike anything Frank had ever witnessed, made all the more disturbing by the creature's constant ghoulish smile and yellow eyes that seemed to enjoy the violence. When Carlito died and gave Frank his locket, the skull-faced figure slowly reached up and grasped the sides of its enormous head. As the ancient artifact was removed, the massive skull visage seemed to dissolve away, revealing the familiar but transformed face of his cousin William West, where once had been wild yellow eyes. William's normal brown eyes now held depths of knowledge and power that seemed impossible for the man Frank remembered. William explained that he discovered the ancient masks during one of his archaeological expeditions, drawn to Willamette by the same mysterious forces that had later attracted the wasp parasites. The artifact had chosen him, he said, granting him the power to become something beyond human, a vessel for primal forces of chaos and violence. But when that power came a terrible hunger for mayhem that grew stronger each time he wore the mask. Together, Frank and William worked to shut down the communications jammer using Carlito's computer. William's enhanced abilities allowed him to process the complex security systems, while Frank handled the technical aspects of the equipment. When U.S. Special Forces arrived with orders to eliminate all survivors, William reluctantly donned the mask once more, his face disappearing behind the enormous grinning skull as he created diversions and brutal eliminations that allowed Otis and the other rescued survivors to escape. At the helipad, Frank waited for his helicopter while William maintained a protective perimeter. The mask had taught William to see patterns in chaos, to anticipate threats before they materialized. But it had also shown him the intoxicating rush of violence. When the helicopter crashed due to a stowaway zombie, William was already moving to intercept the undead before they could reach his fallen cousin, his skull face gleaming with predatory satisfaction. As Frank lost consciousness from his injuries, William fought desperately to keep the zombies at bay. The mass power was formidable, but even ancient artifacts had limits. When Isabella arrived to help, she found William exhausted but still standing guard over Frank's prone form. The enormous skull now seeming well, face now seeming more protective than menacing as those wild eyes watched for threats. During Frank's recovery, William used the mask's supernatural perception to help locate the supplies needed for the parasite suppressing drug. The artifact granted him insight into the mall's hidden spaces and the ability to sense the locations of useful items. Though each transformation left him more drained and hungry for violence. More importantly, it allowed him to protect Frank during his vulnerable search missions, even as the mask's influence grew stronger. When Isabella discovered Carlito's files about the 50 infected orphans, William's face grew grim beneath the mask's skull visage. He could sense the spreading corruption, the way the parasites created a network of malevolent influence across the country. The mask's power came with knowledge, and that knowledge was terrifying. But so was the growing realization that the artifact's bloodlust was becoming harder to control. The final confrontation with Special Forces Commander Brock Mason proved to be William's greatest challenge. Mason had been enhanced by exposure to the parasites, gaining superhuman strength and resilience. But William had the mask's cunning and violent creativity, using both tactical thinking and savage brutality to outmaneuver his opponent. The skull face permanent grin seemed almost appropriate as William fought with ferocity that disturbed even himself. As Mason fell into the zombie hole, William helped Frank exit and Isabella escape through the exit created by the helicopter crash. The mask had served its purpose, but William knew that its work was far from over. The 50 orphans represented a ticking time bomb, and somewhere in the country other supernatural artifacts might be stirring in response to the growing crisis. More troubling still was the way the mask's influence lingered even after he removed it, whispering promises of power and violence. Rack's subsequent reporting on the Willamette incident and Santa Kaziba brought him acclaim, but he never mentioned his cousin's role in the events. William had returned to his quiet life as an insurance adjuster, the mask hidden away until it was needed again. But Frank knew that his cousin was still out there, still watching, still fighting the artifact's corrupting influence ready, while remaining ready to become that grinning skull-faced guardian when the world needed protection from forces beyond human understanding. The truth about Carlito's orphans remained unknown to the public, but William West continued his vigilant watch, knowing that someday the mask would call interaction once more. In a world where agent parasites could create zombie apocalypses, having an agent artifact of chaos and violence in the family was more valuable than any insurance policy, even if that power came with a terrible price that grew heavier with each use. And yeah, that is my best interpretation of a crossover between Dead Rising and The Mask. Anyway, this is pretty much all I got for right now, so please be sure to like, favorite, and subscribe if you kind of like this idea. And if you do like it, want to use it, maybe improve upon it a little bit, all I simply ask is grant me the idea. Okay, bye!